marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
First hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about how to defend the Bible. That's a topic we address many times in this program, but going to look at it in a little bit different way. You know, in the past, there's been kind of the search for the historic Jesus, the quest for the historic Jesus, and sometimes people have been very skeptical about the Bible. Our author actually is suggesting if they were skeptical about some of those skeptical ideas, they'd begin to see, as the subtitle of his book shows, that new discoveries in the quest for Jesus of Nazareth actually confirm the gospel accounts. Archaeology and history are a friend, and we're going to learn a lot more about that today as we talk about this new book, Searching for Jesus. It's published by Thomas Nelson, and it is written by Robert Hutchinson. You may remember him as the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Bible. He is an individual that actually has been a writer for many years, an award-winning writer, I might mention, and interesting, he studied philosophy at Seattle University, and yet was really interested in New Testament issues, so decided to move to Israel to study Hebrew. On returning to the United States, received a master's degree in New Testament and theology from Fuller Theological Seminary, and he is an individual that has been really kind of documenting some of the things that I think actually prove the historical narrative that we see in the Gospels. So, Robert, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me on, Kerby.
I wanted to talk a little bit about your background in history, because I think that is intriguing, that some people, if they want to study Hebrew, well, they actually enroll in an online course or go to a seminary. But you thought, well, I think I'll just go to Israel. That's maybe a better place to learn Hebrew.
Yeah, actually it was, and I learned it as the problem with the way they teach it in seminary, and I've taken that kind of course as well, is they kind of teach it as a dead language, and they use parsing and all these kind of like technical grammatical things, whereas I learned it as a living language, you know, yelling at bus drivers and things like that. So it's actually much more natural to me than say Greek, which I learned in that way. I learned it as in an artificial kind of way. But Hebrew I learned as a living language that people speak, and it's really stuck with me as a result.
Well, one of the things I appreciate about your book is you have a number of pictures, some taken by others, but some taken by you. And I thought it was interesting because those of us that have traveled to Israel, and I might mention we're going to have another trip that will take place next year in May, this is a chance for you to see a Capernaum. It's a chance to see the Sea of Galilee. It's a chance to see some of the archaeological digs, the Pool of Bethesda. And so it's really interesting that not only your book really helps document some of the very important historical and archaeological finds, which I believe confirm the Gospels, and you certainly argue in the book, but it also is a little bit like a travelogue. And so people that are either going to Israel or have come back from Israel, I think, will really benefit from a book that's over 300 pages.
Oh, absolutely. Anybody who's a Christian, or even if somebody who's not a Christian, should go to Israel. It'll just blow your mind, because the Bible just comes alive when you're walking around and all the various sites. And much of the Galilee is still very rural.
Yes.
And it still looks an awful lot like what it must have looked like in the time of Jesus. And you go out on a boat on the Sea of Galilee, and it is truly a life-changing experience.
Certainly. 11 chapters. We'll do our best in an hour to try to cover some of them. And one of those is the issue of the eyewitness testimony of the Gospels. Now, again, if you take kind of the liberal, secular scholarship that's existed for more than a century, it is that you had this oral tradition, and it was a long period before anything was ever written down. And some of this might have been written down maybe by a few of the eyewitnesses, but a lot of these were stories of stories of stories. And so you get what I call the telephone game. But in your first chapter, you talk about the fact that we have very good evidence, actually, that these, number one, were eyewitnesses, and some of the various parts of the gospel, like Mark, were written down just years after the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's one of the big changes. My book is basically about how in just the past few years there have been some astonishing discoveries, both in archaeology and New Testament studies, that are overturning all of these older ideas that are literally a century old. All the stuff you hear about what the scholars say and all that stuff, these are 100 to 150-year-old ideas. But in the most recent years, it's skeptical scholars, secular scholars, non-Christian Jewish scholars at major universities who are discovering this stuff, and they are now rejecting those older ideas. One of them they're rejecting increasingly is this whole idea that the sayings and deeds of Jesus were an oral tradition that was passed on word of mouth like the telephone game, were only written down much, much later. Increasingly, they think that model, by the way, was based on the German accounts of how German fairy tales developed over centuries. And instead, they're realizing that no, the time frame we're talking about is 20 to 40 years. It's not the same situation. And so that model of how the Gospels came to be written, or how the sources of the Gospels came to be written, is now being rejected.
Sure. And even if you accept the premise, and of course the Bart Ehrmans and some of them want to break that up, or anybody that brings it up these days, the telephone game still illustrates an interesting point. Because if you've ever played the telephone game, that is, I tell a story, whisper it to one person, they whisper it to us, and by the time it gets to the back of the room, it's nothing like that. The point is, you got people in the front of the room say, no, that's not the way the story was. And the point is that not only do you have the eyewitnesses, but you have other people that were eyewitnesses and other skeptics who were eyewitness that did not disagree with the facts. So even if you use the telephone game as an illustration, it doesn't work for you very well. And of course, we now know, and you talk about this, that we now have manuscripts that take us back to the first century. So this isn't, we only have things that were hundreds of years later. We don't know even what the original writing was, and we don't know what the gap was between the event and before it was written down. I mean, a lot of that is beginning to close down pretty quickly, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the earliest texts, the earliest copies we have for most of ancient history are 1,000 years old. In other words, the earliest copies we have of Herodotus and Thucydides and Julius Caesar and all that are 1,000 years after the events. We have papyri. We've discovered papyri of the Gospel of John. It's called P52, that dates perhaps between 20 and 30 years after the original was composed. Okay, that is an astonishing temporal proximity to the events, and that's unlike anything else we have for any other ancient documents and events and people. So yes, I mean, we are increasingly realizing, and the skeptical scholars are realizing that we have a lot more eyewitness testimony than we thought we had.
Again, we're going to come back after the break and talk a little bit more about this. We got into some of the eyewitness testimony. Let's next, when we come back from the break, talk about who Jesus was, because you have all sorts of different speculation about who he was and what he actually claimed, and whether he was a deluded apocalyptic prophet or a violent revolutionary or a social reformer or a charismatic faith healer, whatever those might be, and get into that. We'll get back into a little bit on the reliability of the manuscripts. Have we even found the home of Jesus? Maybe even what the boats look like that were actually used by Peter and others. And then, of course, what about this idea of a suffering Messiah? Wasn't that just created by the church, and that's not something that was actually believed at the time? We'll get into the Jewishness of Jesus. How kosher was Jesus? And did he have a secret message? And did he plan his own crucifixion? And was the proof of the resurrection really there? And so much more. And again, the subtitle of this book, I think, is indicative of what you will find, how new discoveries in the quest for Jesus of Nazareth, and how they confirm the gospel accounts. If anything, those skeptics should have been skeptical about their own skepticism, if you can follow that logic. And that's what we're going to do today as we continue our conversation on the search for Jesus. We'll have more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What religious rights do Christians have in the workplace? A court case in Atlanta may begin to restrict those rights in ways that should concern us. The case involves former Atlanta Fire Chief Kelvin Cochran, and as I discussed in my previous commentary, he was fired from his job because of a devotional book that he wrote that addressed sexual issues from a biblical perspective. Cochran has been a firefighter since the early 1980s. He was even appointed by President Obama as the U.S. Fire Administrator for the United States and has been the fire chief of Atlanta from 2008 until the beginning of this year. A lawyer for Alliance Defending Freedom said that the city of Atlanta actually argued that you're entitled to have your beliefs and opinions, but you have to keep them to yourself inside the four walls of your house or your church, that you shouldn't bring them out into the public, and you shouldn't bring them out if you're employed by a government agency. It's worth remembering that Cochran gave his book to some fellow employees but did not talk about these issues while on the force. There was not a problem until a copy of the book made it to the city councilman who is openly homosexual. The councilman, in a statement to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, said, "I respect each individual's right to have their own thoughts, beliefs, and opinions, but when you're a city employee and those thoughts, beliefs, and opinions are different from the city's, you have to check them at the door." Atlanta's mayor said that he felt the book would be disturbing to the LGBT community. It's also worth mentioning that no one has ever accused Cochran of discrimination against anyone based upon his or her sexual orientation or on any other characteristic. I think this is merely about the biblical perspective in the book. That may be why the city is now trying to say that he was terminated for other reasons than the religious nature of the book. I think this case and a number of others will determine whether we have true religious freedom in the workplace. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about the book Searching for Jesus, New Discoveries in the Quest for Jesus of Nazareth, and how they confirm the gospel accounts. Robert Hutchinson with us as we talk about his new book published by Thomas Nelson. We have information about him and a link to his website as well as this book. You probably will be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to order it as well. Are there some pretty good reasons why we would believe that most of the New Testament was written before 70 A.D.?
Yes. I mean, first of all, most scholars, and I think even still today, many scholars believe the Gospels themselves were written after 70 A.D. because there are places, as you know, where there seems to be a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem, but increasingly many skeptical non-Christian scholars are saying that really doesn't make sense because there's no reference to the destruction of Jerusalem that actually occurred, and that anybody living in Palestine in those years, you didn't have to be the son of God or a prophet to know that war was coming and that the temple was likely to be destroyed. And a secular scholar in the UK has recently challenged the dating of the Gospel of Mark, which many scholars until recently have said it's probably written 40 years after the crucifixion. And this scholar says, no, it was likely written 5 or 10 years after the crucifixion, which pushes it back an awful lot sooner. And he's not the only one. There's been many other, even very liberal scholars who have challenged this over the years, the consensus view that they were written very late.
It's hard to believe that people held to that, because think about that. Okay, maybe you could say the prophecy part of it, but you've got to believe that most of the New Testament had to be written before 70 A.D. because they don't reference one of the most significant events in that era and at that time period and in that region, and that is the fall of Jerusalem. And, you know, the book of Acts ends, written by Luke, with no comment about that. The Gospels, certainly you have to have Paul and Peter killed during the Neronian persecution. So in some respects, it's always been amazing to me that people believe that the New Testament was written so late in light of that. But let's, if we can, maybe move to your second chapter, because you talk about the various portraits that individuals have had. And over the last century or two, you've had sort of the quest for the historic Jesus. But now we know a lot more about Jesus from everything from the manuscripts that we have to even a little bit of extra biblical history and archaeology that help us understand indeed the portrait that we get of Jesus, especially in the Gospel of John, is perhaps a very accurate portrait indeed.
That's right. I mean, a lot of these ideas, one of my big points and that I'm really trying to get across is when you watch television specials and you see these people talking about what the scientific view is or what the latest cutting-edge scholarly view of Jesus, these ideas are literally 100 to 150 years old, okay? When the whole idea that Jesus was a angry apocalyptic prophet who predicted that the world would end in his lifetime, in other words, he was mistaken and deluded, that dates back to at least 1904 when Albert Schweitzer wrote his classic book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus. Bart Ehrman says the same thing. In all of Bart Ehrman's books, he basically repeats this concept, which is 100 years old. That concept and the idea that Jesus was a zealot and all that are under increasing assault by skeptical scholars at major universities. Increasingly, people do not buy the argument that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. And that's actually becoming a minority view. I mean, for a long time it was the dominant view, but the most cutting-edge scholars today are rejecting it. And they're definitely rejecting the idea that Jesus was a zealot. If Jesus was a zealot, there would have been 1,000 crosses on Golgotha, not just 3. So the Romans would never have tolerated and allowed Jesus' followers to continue to operate in Jerusalem. As we know from all of our records from the New Testament, from Josephus, they would never have done that. We know that they crucified 500 people a day during the revolt against Rome. They crucified 2,000 people during the last revolt that occurred after Herod's death. The Romans would not have allowed the followers of Jesus to continue operating freely in Jerusalem if they really thought that Jesus was a revolutionary. And that backs up the basic portrait of what happened in the Gospels, that Jesus was basically set up on trumped-up charges of being a revolutionary, which he was innocent of.
Yes, very good. Well, just a lot of great material in each one of these chapters, but I like to keep it moving so that people get a good overview. And in Chapter 3, you do talk about, are the Gospels forgeries? And you begin by talking about Daniel Wallace. He's been in the studio with us many times before, director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, an individual that's debated people like Bart Ehrman. But it does seem to me that we live, Robert, in a world in which some people say, well, what about these Gnostic Gospels? You know, they're quoted in the Da Vinci Code, and some people have even read them, and I'm getting you laughing now, and maybe we have the wrong Gospels in our Bible. How do we respond?
Well, I laugh because I've actually read them. And anybody can read them now. That's one of the idea that they've been suppressed and everything. We have 4 or 5 critical editions of the Gnostic Gospels. We don't have that many. We have fragments from a few. We have, I think, the complete text of maybe 7. And anybody who actually reads them will instantly realize why they were rejected by the early church, because they are absolutely bizarre. They are very anti-woman. They are outright misogynistic. They reflect these Gnostic ideas that the true God, that the creator of this world was evil, and that there's another God, a higher God, beyond this world, and that the goal of life is to obtain knowledge and all that. It has none of the gritty detail and common sense of the canonical Gospels. So that's really a red herring. Most scholars today, with a very few exceptions, don't take the Gnostic Gospels seriously as historical sources. They're interesting to tell us about Gnostic sects that existed 200 or 300 or 400 years after Jesus, but they don't really tell us anything about Jesus.
And they weren't written by individuals that were eyewitnesses. Back to our key point just a few minutes ago. I mean, you'll see the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, but it wasn't written by Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Philip, I mean, those were written in the 2nd or 3rd century, depending which one you're talking about. We have the Gospel of Judas, and I always like to say to an audience, does anybody know why Judas did not write the Gospel of Judas? And I get a laugh on that one usually. But the point is that they've called him the Gospel of Robert. Well, nobody'd read them, so they had fanciful names, but they were not written by eyewitnesses. They were not apostolic. They were written much later. They were not orthodox, and you can go down a very long list for why they are not in our Bible. But a young person in a college maybe even an introduction to religion class might hear that and say, I didn't know that my Bible doesn't have the right Gospels in it. And this is why I think your book is so helpful. It's certainly a book that will sort of clear up some of the misconceptions people have. And it's a good antidote to what happens every Christmas and every Easter. You know, it's going to be in Time and Newsweek. All of those are going to have pictures of Jesus, and it isn't going to be presenting the orthodox view of Jesus, and it's not going to be telling you that the Bible is reliable. It's going to give you, quote, the latest scholarship, which, as you point out, is 100 years old, and that's why it's important to have a book like this on people's shelves.
Oh, thanks very much. That was my intention, was to bring people up to date, that a lot of the ideas they hear in the media are simply obsolete, and nobody believes them anymore. Nobody in the scholarly community believes them anymore, but they're paraded in the media as if it's everyone knows this, or that it's just widely held opinions in the academy, and that's just not true.
So again, one other one I might put on the table: have archaeologists found the house of Jesus? Now, we don't necessarily believe the actual house, but it could be. But they have done quite a bit of digging there in Nazareth, and they've been able to find a first-century stone house. And so it is quite possible that we have found either a home very much like Jesus. You have a picture of what's called the Jesus boat. It's there at the Sea of Galilee. I've had a chance to see it up close and personal. We don't believe Jesus was in that boat, but it comes from the first century as well. So in a lot of cases, archaeology is helping to confirm the narrative that we have in the Gospels.
That's absolutely true. I mean, there have been some astonishing discoveries. I mean, I've been to that house, the stone house in Nazareth, and when you see it, I mean, there was very little archaeological proof that Nazareth existed, even the very little textual proof. It wasn't mentioned by Josephus and all that. And so a lot of people, a lot of the so-called mythicists, the people that say that Jesus is just a myth and the Gospels are entirely fiction, have pointed to that fact that there was no evidence of an historical Nazareth as proof that Jesus never really existed. And that's really dangerous. These are called arguments for silence, because sure enough, within a year or two of people making that argument, they uncover a first-century stone house, or the remnants of a first-century stone house, that proves that Nazareth was occupied during the time, during Jesus' era. And it's probably, people jokingly say, we found Jesus' house, but it was a small village, and so there is a possibility that the two houses they've discovered could possibly have been the house in which he was raised. One of them was actually, in tradition, was called that, was his house.
It's called that. So who knows,
Who knows,
And we'll talk about Peter's house and some of those others in Capernaum, but we have to take one of those mandatory breaks. As we do so, I would encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. We're still looking for some of you that would like to help us build a match for next week. And so if you'd like to contribute to that, I think Bob will have a little more to say about that in just a minute. But let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion about the search for Jesus.
We have never done this before. We are asking you, as a Point of View listener and supporter, to step up this week and lead others in giving. We are building a match challenge fund for next week's Truth Team 360 event. A way to take your donation, your gift, and double it. Double it. You give the gift will encourage someone. What I need right now is for what you can do. I'm looking for 43, whether it's $30, $3. Call now, 1-800-34 800-347-51 view.net. The Truth Team. Point of View will continue.
are listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. We're talking about the search for Jesus. The book is entitled Searching for Jesus, New Discoveries in the Quest for Jesus of Nazareth, and How They Confirm the Gospel Accounts. And it is written by Robert Hutchinson. It is published by Thomas Nelson. It's over 300 pages and some great material that you are going to find helpful. We have information about his work, his website, and the book on our website, pointofview.net. Robert, let's, if we can, for just a minute, to back off and talk about this importance of the state of Israel. You mentioned that when we talk about archaeology. Of course, a lot of us are supporters of the nation of Israel. Certainly, we have taken tours, and we'll take another one next year to Israel. But that is all part of the fact that this, because of the relative peace, certainly of some of the regions, there has been a lot more archaeological digs, a lot more archaeological investigation, and because of that, we not only know a lot more about these ancient civilizations, in particular Israel, but we also have been able to confirm the historical accuracy of the Old and New Testament.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, it just basically we've got generations of extremely talented and dedicated Israeli archaeologists and other international teams that have been combing through Israel in vast archaeological digs, and they've discovered an awful lot of things. And when they uncover something in Israel, I mean, the smallest artifact, when they're building something, everything stops, and they bring in the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and archaeologists are there, and so they really, really cherish their biblical heritage, and they go to great lengths to protect it and to allow archaeologists to do their work when they're building things. And since they're building a lot, Israel is an expanding economy. There's lots of construction going on. As a result, there's a lot of archaeological digs going on almost everywhere. So that's very, very important, and it's allowed us to discover a huge amount of information in just the last 20 to 40 years.
Let's see, we can, again, just re-emphasize that in Nazareth, like you said, you have these houses, and that may be, one of those could be a house of Jesus. If not, it certainly shows you what a first-century house would be like. We've gone to Nazareth, we've gone to Capernaum, and that's been very helpful because here you have the synagogue. It's built on top of the one that Jesus was preaching on, but here you are right there. There is pretty good evidence that they have discovered what many people believe is the home of Peter, his wife, and his mother-in-law, where Jesus most likely stayed. And we have this so-called Jesus boat. Talk a little bit more about some of these archaeological finds and how these, once again, just provide confirmation of the biblical account.
Yeah, well, the Jesus boat, as you've seen it, it's amazing. It's in disrepair, as you might imagine. But they just discovered it in 1986. It was a very, very low time where the water was very low on the Sea of Galilee, and it was embedded in the mud. They think it might have been sunk during the Jewish War in 66 or 67 when the Roman ships went out and attacked all the Jewish boats that were on the water, and it might have sunk during that. But it's probably a very, very good example of the type of boat that Peter and Jesus would have been in. And the Jesus house is another astonishing find. They're pretty confident that this was Peter's house because of the graffiti that they found on the wall over centuries, that it was a house church. And right now there's a modern kind of church built over it, but you can still look down and you can see all the structures and everything. Equally amazing is the discovery of the ossuaries in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. They have uncovered almost certainly the burial box, the bone box as they call it, of the high priest Caiaphas. There's another one that they may have discovered is that of James the Just, who was the brother or relative or cousin, depending on your theological point of view on that, of Jesus, and he was the leader of the Jerusalem church. So these are dramatic archaeological confirmations. These were not fictional characters. These were real people, and this is archaeological proof that they existed. So it's just been a very, very exciting time in just the last 10 or 20 years in terms of archaeology.
A couple other things you talk about. Did the church invent the idea of a suffering Messiah? This is an argument that was made for some time, is that they didn't really expect that. They expected the Messiah to be victorious, and there were very few that were looking at Isaiah 53. But here again, archaeology has helped us because indeed they found what is called the Gabriel revelation. You'll need, of course, to explain a little bit of that, but it shows that even at the time there was this belief that indeed the Messiah would suffer based upon, of course, Old Testament passages.
Yes, and that was one of the foundations of some of the attacks on the reliability of the New Testament. The early German critics in the early 20th century, the leading New Testament scholars that sort of set the pace, they basically said that this was not historical. This was an apologetic device after the fact, that the idea that the Jews were expecting a suffering Messiah, and that they reinterpreted Old Testament passages that had nothing to do with that really, because they weren't expecting a suffering Messiah. They were expecting a conquering hero that would reestablish the Davidic kingdom. So that was one of the key reasons to question the reliability of the New Testament. We now know that that's simply not true. We discovered in 2000 a first-century stone tablet written in Hebrew that speaks about a coming Messiah who would suffer, die, and perhaps even rise again. So there are other texts also that we've discovered that date from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other times that the early Germans didn't know about that show that the Jews in Jesus' time were expecting, or at least some Jews were expecting a suffering Messiah, not a conquering hero. So that kicks out, that eliminates one of the strongest arguments to challenge the historical reliability of the New Testament, of the Gospels.
You know, some of you have sent your kids off to college, and maybe they are coming back at Thanksgiving or sometime for Christmas or whenever it might be, and they're going to have some really bizarre ideas. And this is the kind of book you want to have on your shelf and say, while you got a few minutes, I want you to read a few of these chapters here, because the things you've been hearing in Religion 101 or in some of these other classes, maybe History 101, Western Civilization, aren't true. And I think you're going to be able to find that there is very good archaeological evidence for some of this.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I wanted to hear your comment because I made you laugh.
And, what I want to really emphasize is this is not a book of Christian apologetics, the classic book of Christian apologetics. Some of my best friends are Christian apologists.
Yeah.
But the people I'm writing about are skeptical scholars.
Yes.
They are secular people. They're Jewish scholars and so on. And they're the ones that are saying that a lot of this stuff is nonsense. And they... that's why I think college kids and people that have questions, legitimate questions, should read this book, because it's not just a restatement of classical Christian apologetics, which I, of course, am all for, but it's really a new approach that shows how the skeptical scholars are now skeptical of their own skepticism, as you said.
Well, again, I know that logic's sometimes hard to follow, but I think the skeptics should have been skeptical of their skepticism, because now we know a lot more about the history. And in many cases, we see a trend here, Robert, and that is, I've seen this for some time as I've studied not only the history of the church, but also, of course, studied theology, apologetics, and other things. And that is, oftentimes when you have a potential conflict where the scholars or the skeptics say the Bible is wrong, you just have to sort of wait a while, because what we find out is eventually the skeptics are wrong and the Bible is right. As some people have illustrated, the Bible's like the anvil, and people have been pounding with their hammers on that anvil, but eventually they don't wear out the anvil, they wear out their hammers. And so again, we can see some of these ideas that have been around sometimes for as much as a century are beginning to die a natural death simply because archaeology, history, further reflection are giving us some very good answers. So when we come back, I wanted to talk a little bit more about one or two of the other issues. There are so many, and again, 11 chapters. We couldn't possibly cover all of them in 1 hour, but I think you've got a pretty good handle on a book that maybe you did not know about until we started talking about it. It's just out, Searching for Jesus, New Discoveries in the Quest for Jesus of Nazareth, and how they confirm the gospel accounts. And Robert Hutchinson is with us. And I might just mention that if you go to our website and click on the See More button right next to his picture, that will take you to roberthutchison.com. You can go there directly, but we've spelled it out for you. And there you can find out a little bit more about him, some of the videos, his books, and speaking and other things if you'd like to contact him and know a little bit more. Of course, he's featuring right now this book, but I mentioned before some of the others that you might be familiar with. including one that we have talked about in the past, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Bible. And so if you would like to find out a little bit more about him, we have that on our website, pointofview.net. We'll come back and maybe take on one or two more of these really important issues because there are so many. But some of the attitudes that people have about Jesus, I think we sort of dealt with whether or not he was a zealot. But how kosher was he? And certainly some of the questions about his execution, crucifixion, and resurrection. So we'll look at a few of those real quickly before we wind down for the hour. But again, the book is entitled Searching for Jesus, New Discoveries. And certainly you can begin to see how archaeology and history are the friend to the Bible. And so we'll come back and continue our conversation with Robert Hutchinson right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Robert Hutchinson with us for just a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Searching for Jesus. You know, in your chapter, How Kosher Was Jesus, of course, you talk about his Jewish background, but that brings me to one that I've run into quite often. I suspect some of our listeners have as well, and that is the picture we have of Jesus can't be true. Because after all, he was born in Nazareth, actually born in Bethlehem, but he raised in Nazareth, and he was a carpenter's son, and he was probably illiterate. He probably did not know that much about the scriptures, and here you have this very well-educated individual first at the age of 12 and then at his public ministry when he's in his 30s, very conversant with Scripture and very able to debate with the Pharisees. But I think what you point out is we now know a lot more about the fact that oftentimes even highly trained rabbis would have what you might call a blue-collar occupation so that they would not be a burden on their students. And really what we see with Jesus is an individual that understood the Pharisees and understood a very important interpretation of Scripture, and in many cases even threw some of their ideas and logic back upon them.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, that's another one of the amazing new discoveries that have been happening. Why I keep putting the emphasis on new, because there's been tons of new stuff that has been uncovered in just the last 5, 10, 15 years that is just revolutionizing how secular people understand Jesus. And one of the big revelations has been Israeli Orthodox Jews and Israeli scholars have been really studying the New Testament lately, and they've been going over the arguments that Jesus had with the Pharisees. And for at least a century, people said, well, those weren't historical. Those reflected debates that the later Christians had with Pharisees after the destruction of Jerusalem and so on. But increasingly, Israeli scholars, Jewish scholars who are experts in the Talmud say, no, this actually makes much more sense before the fall of the temple. And not only that, Jesus displays an incredibly sophisticated knowledge of Jewish law and of the arguments of Jewish law, and they document that in I go into it in great detail in my book. It's a little too technical to talk about on the radio, but
Sure.
They show that Jesus had a mastery of the fine points of Jewish law, and that in most cases, at least according to the Jewish scholars, he was absolutely correct, and he had legitimate beefs with the Pharisees, and he probably wasn't the only one that had beefs with the Pharisees, and so that's just been a really big revelation that no, Jesus might not have been an illiterate peasant, but actually a highly trained rabbi who did continue to work in a manual job, as many did. I mean, Hillel was a shoemaker, I believe, and we would point to Paul as a tent maker. So it's not inconceivable that Jesus continued to work as a carpenter while he immersed himself in Jewish law and tradition and Scripture.
Yes. Well, let's, if we can, make sure we don't leave Jesus in the grave. So let's talk about what kind of archaeological evidence we have for his death, burial, and resurrection. And you have whole chapters on that, but it does seem to me, again, that we have proof of the resurrection. We, of course, have talked about that from a scriptural point of view, a historical point of view. But again, we have some newer, if you will, understanding, both in history and archaeology, about the story that is written in the Gospels and how we can see that fits very well with the eyewitness accounts that were recorded at that time.
Yeah, well, one of the things I deal with, of course, are the Talpiot tombs, which is they've uncovered some tombs in South Jerusalem that some people claim were the Jesus family tombs. And my book debunks that, because most Israeli scholars and other experts say that's just not true. This was not Jesus' family tomb, even though people point to ossuaries that had some names on them that sound like biblical names that you would recognize. They are not convinced. The Israelis are not convinced that this was Jesus' family tomb. So that's one thing. The other major change is, even among the very, very skeptical scholars, even agnostic scholars such as Bart Ehrman, no longer believe the old ideas that this was made up, or the resurrection appearances were made up, or they were frauds, or they were hallucinations, or something like that. They now concede that the earliest followers of Jesus sincerely believed that they encountered the risen Christ. Now, they might not believe that was true, like Bart Ehrman and other agnostics don't accept that, but they do accept that they had real experiences. And that's been a big change. And part of the reason for this is, another big thing they've discovered is that the notion that Jesus was divine, they used to think that only came about when the Jesus movement left Palestine and moved into the pagan Greek world.
Yes.
And so these pagan ideas of divinity were kind of infected Christianity. But in the last few years have become very sophisticated at figuring out the earliest portions of the New Testament. And much to the astonishment of these secular scholars, it's the earliest parts of the New Testament that speak about Jesus sitting at the right hand of God.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah,
And,
again,
yeah.
there's the idea that you had the Jesus of history and then the Christ of faith. And, then Jesus later became God in the minds of those individuals. Now, I think that's been set aside, and we have talked a little bit about that as well. Just before we run out of time, I wanted, Robert, for you to mention what's available on your website. We do have a link to it, and I figure that there will be some people that maybe would like to get a copy of this book or others. Maybe they'd like to see some of the other media that you have available there, or they might speak or something of that nature. So talk about some of the resources that are available there at roberthutchinson.com.
Well, if they want to find me, they can go to roberthutchinson.com. If they want information about the book has its own website, as they do now, searchingforjesus.tv. And it's got sample chapters you can download. You can get a feel for what the book's about. It's got endorsements I'm very proud that I've got some great endorsements from famous Christian theologians like N.T. Wright, but I also have endorsements from skeptical scholars who say that I'm fair to their point of view, and I'm not creating straw men, that I present their positions accurately. So you can go to either of those places for more information, either about me or about the book.
Very good. Again, I only had an advanced uncorrected proof, so I didn't have all the endorsements. Otherwise, I would have read some of those, so people can go to those websites and find out a little bit more. We do have a link there, so you can find out more and order it, and I think you should be able to find it in your local bookstore just coming out. But I wanted to give you an opportunity today to hear a little bit more of some of the perspectives that sometimes don't get covered in the mainstream media or in academic circles. And so, again, if you got a young person coming home with some strange ideas, you might put this book in their hand. You got maybe a neighbor that says, no, the Bible says that's just myth and legend, or Jesus didn't claim to be God, or whatever. I think you're going to find that this will be something that if they'll be willing to read it, they're going to find out that maybe they're taking ideas that are at least 100 years old. So, Robert, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, for having me on the show.
We will take a break, and just before we do so, one of the things I mentioned yesterday is that next week, of course, we have our Truth 360 program. And that's where we'll have Gary Bauer and Tim Wildman and Penny Nance and Michael Ferris and Al Mohler and Robert, Louis Gomer and a few other people that we're going to have. And so we always like to, when we interview them, also challenge you to become one of our True 360 partners. And one of the things that some people have done over the years is said, I would like to give, but I'd like to have people match it. In other words, I'll match dollar for dollar, whatever comes in. And so if some of you would want to do that, we wanted to give you that opportunity. We've never done that before, but as I mentioned yesterday, just before the program began, I decided to do that. So I went to our website, pointofview.net, clicked on that banner that says help us build a match, and I gave a substantial gift, which I hope will be used next week to encourage some of you to join with us. And so if you would want to do that, we've made that available on the website, pointofview.net. Hope you'll be listening for and looking forward to those interviews. And I hope you'll be looking forward to our interview next hour, because Dr. Kevin Leman is with us. He'll be in studio, so not only can you listen to the program, I would encourage you to click on that button that says watch, and you can watch our interview in the studio or else watch it later on our YouTube channel. So let's take a break. When we come back, Dr. Kevin Leman with us, Planet Middle School. Should be interesting. It's always a lot of fun. We'll be back right after this.
If someone offers you an investment that is sure to double your money, what's the best way to respond? Yeah, run away. Run now, but hear me out. Next week is our fall push to sign up new members for Truth Team 360. What we need today is a leader willing to encourage others to give. Your gift will be used to match their gifts next week. You might give $360 and officially join the team, or make that big donation, $1,000, $500,000, or perhaps for you a donation of $50 is as much of a sacrifice as it is for that person who gives $1 million. Bottom line, this week we are gathering matching gifts so that next week we can encourage everyone else to match what you do. Come on, you're the one. Call now, 800-347-5151. Or online, pointofview.net/team. We've never done this before. Be the one who steps up and leads. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
As I mentioned last hour, we have in studio with us Dr. Kevin Leman. And again, if you'd like to watch the program as well as listen to it, go to our website. You can click on either watch or listen. And again, he should be no stranger to many of the listeners here to Point of View. We've talked about so many different books with him over these years. The Birth Order book, Making Children Mine Without Losing Yours, Having a New Kid by Friday, and this new book, Planet Middle School, Helping Your Child Through Peer Pressure, Awkward Moments, and Emotional Drama. Dr. Kevin Leman, you've been on this program many times. You've been on Focus on the Family more than 50 times. So it's just great to have you here.
You know what that means?
Yeah.
It means I'm going to die soon. I'm getting old.
Getting old. Well, I think the first time you and I did an interview was almost 30 years ago. Of course, you were 10 at the time, right?
Yeah.
So it is amazing that still all these great books that you produce, and it's just a delight to have you on the program today. Let me mention, as you click on the website, pointofview.net, we have a link to Dr. Kevin Leman, and you can see that. It's under the birthorderguy.com if you want to find that particular one. There's a lot of others there that you can find as well. Also, of course, information about the book. It is 16 chapters, 300 pages, published by Fleming Revell. You should be able to easily find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've given it an opportunity for you to order it as well. You're wearing today, for anybody watching online, the Leman Academy of Excellence. And so before we get into the book, let's talk about that, because you've actually put together a charter school. You want to develop others, and that charter school, I believe, is in Tucson, correct?
It is, Kerby, but it's proof that God is the original humorist.
Yes.
Because I was a kid who grew up in Buffalo, New York area and graduated fourth in my class, which sounds awesome. Unfortunately, it was fourth in the bottom and not fourth in the top. And I've shared that story so many times. And I think that people sometimes think, well, maybe Leman's stretching it a little bit. Well, I ran into my freshman report card.
And it's in the back of your book. And I laughed out loud when I saw it.
I had to put it in there.
Yeah.
It's so funny. My final grade in algebra was 22.
22. I saw it.
Back in New York State, if you really didn't pass, but they wanted to get rid of you, and back in those days, social promotion was big, they gave you a 65, which was minimal passing, and they'd circle it to let you know you really didn't pass it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I saw that circle. I wondered what that meant.
That's what it means. They just, and of course, I was a cut up. I was a class clown, wild bird calls. I still remember crawling out of Mr. Giffen's world history class. And he was clueless that I was leaving, and all the kids were laughing, and he didn't even realize what was going on. And so I was one of those kids, baby of the family, followed two very successful firstborn son. My brother, sister, and brother, yeah.
Hold it up just in case anybody's looking. There it is, the report card. And the circle around 65 is saying, we're going to graduate this guy because we don't want to keep him in the 9th grade another year.
And I flunked PE, and I was an athlete, so figure that out. But, it's interesting because, and this goes back to the topic of Planet Middle School.
For sure.
There was a teacher who was, in my estimation, somewhere between estrogen and death, who pulled me aside one day and said, Kevin, do you think you could ever use those skills you have for something positive in life? Well, Kerby Anderson, I'm here to tell you that was the very first time that I recall a teacher saying that I had skills.
That's something.
And she got my attention, and I went to my guidance counselor's office, and I said, Mr. Messino, I too would like to go on to college, onto a university. And he sort of grunted. He looked down at me over his glasses, And he said, Leman, with your grades and your record in this school, I couldn't get you admitted to reform school. I had SAT scores that were at the 0 percentile. Now, if you don't know much about that, folks, that means 100% of the people who took that exam did better than I did. But I thought it was so cool because at the University of Buffalo, where I took the exam, they allow you to smoke cigarettes.
Yeah.
In the classroom. I said, and I was such a punk. Yeah. There I was, 17 years old, smoking my Salem cigarettes, thinking I was so cool. In retrospect, I was just a dumb idiot.
Yeah.
But life has its way of teaching students at the University of Arizona and a professor, and I'm still teaching. But the school is a testimony to really the fact that God is the great humorist, because why he allowed that to happen. And now we're putting these schools in. We're looking at Savannah, Georgia. We're looking at Colorado Springs, Colorado. And parents love it. Kids love it. Teachers thank me daily for building the school. And it's just been awesome. It's a public school. It's a charter school.
Sure.
We challenge kids. They take Spanish in kindergarten and Latin in the 3rd grade. I took Latin 5 times.
Yeah, I saw you took Latin.
Passed it twice. Once because a guy named Carl Maz. Thank you, Carl. Hey, Maz, lower your left shoulder. Yeah. So there I am, confessing all my sins on your program today.
It's really something. But now it's Dr. Kevin Leman, and if you look at the 9th grade report card, you were a late bloomer, as you like to say, right?
I was a late bloomer. I've told you, you probably forgot this, but do you remember, well, blah, 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 can't get the words out. Do you remember what my middle name is?
I forget now.
Anderson.
We
could be related.
I did not remember that. That is amazing. Well, again, the book is Planet Middle School. When you talk about middle school kids in ministry, we used to call them electric chihuahuas, but here you talk about
I had never heard that. That's so funny.
Creature from the Black Lagoon. And again, we recognize that there are a lot of things happening in middle school. Certainly hormones and discovering of the opposite sex. But there are also some other things going on as well. The desire for autonomy, peer pressure. And if that's not enough, Dr. Kevin Leman, we have something that's really a relatively new phenomenon, and that's those digital devices in their hands, which I think makes some of those problems even worse. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a perfect storm. Those gadgets, by the way, those electronics, I call the new Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
And parents, I'll use a clinical term, are so stupid. They put these instruments in kids' hands, and if you're driving, hang on to the wheel. In the 2nd grade, in the 3rd grade, they're giving kids smartphones.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's an overload. And so it does. We do have a perfect storm, though, because you got kids who are pulling away, and pubescence and adolescence, that's what they do. They're beginning to establish, who they are. But most parents are reactionary. Rather than responding to kids, they react, and they button down the hatches, so to speak, and come across way too autocratic. I made this statement the other night, actually at Leman Academy of Excellence, and I said, there's only one way to rear a kid. Only one way. And when you say something like that, you're painting yourself in the corner. And most of us come out of an authoritarian family where we had parents who said, hey, you listen up. You're going to do what I tell you to do.
Yeah.
Hey, you want something to cry about? I'll give you something to cry about. Now, how many of us can respond to that? Well, that's the authoritarian model,
right?
Okay? And I'm here to tell you that Almighty God is not an authoritarian, and yet he is the supreme authority. So we've got parents who love the authoritarian model. Many of them come from the church. And we have the permissives. You can't walk 5 feet without hitting the permissive.
Yeah.
They're the ones that,
And you got the helicopter parents and the snowplow parents you talk about here in the book.
Absolutely. But either extreme, which I think is interesting.
Enablers,
creates rebellion in a kid's heart. So being an authority over your kid is not an easy thing because our carnal self says, hey, shut them down and tell them where the bone's buried. And that's not the way to handle, especially middle schoolers.
Planet Middle School. We'll talk more about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
What religious rights do Christians have in the workplace? A court case in Atlanta may begin to restrict those rights in ways that should concern us. The case involves former Atlanta Fire Chief Kelvin Cochran, and as I discussed in my previous commentary, he was fired from his job because of a devotional book that he wrote that addressed sexual issues from a biblical perspective. Cochran has been a firefighter since the early 1980s. He was even appointed by President Obama as the U.S. Fire Administrator for the United States and has been the fire chief of Atlanta from 2008 until the beginning of this year. A lawyer for Alliance Defending Freedom said that the city of Atlanta actually argued that you're entitled to have your beliefs and opinions, but you have to keep them to yourself inside the four walls of your house or your church, that you shouldn't bring them out into the public, and you shouldn't bring them out if you're employed by a government agency. It's worth remembering that Cochran gave his book to some fellow employees but did not talk about these issues while on the force. There was not a problem until a copy of the book made it to the city councilman who is openly homosexual. The councilman, in a statement to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, said, "I respect each individual's right to have their own thoughts, beliefs, and opinions, but when you're a city employee, and those thoughts, beliefs, and opinions are different from the city's, you have to check them at the door." Atlanta's mayor said that he felt the book would be disturbing to the LGBT community. It's also worth mentioning that no one has ever accused Cochran of discrimination against anyone based upon his or her sexual orientation or on any other characteristic. I think this is merely about the biblical perspective in the book. That may be why the city is now trying to say that he was terminated for other reasons than the religious nature of the book. I think this case and a number of others will determine whether we have true religious freedom in the workplace. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Planet Middle School. It is a new book out by Dr. Kevin Leman, and again, it is published by Revell, 300 pages, about 16 chapters, and again, we all can relate. When my kids were in middle school, if we were driving them to the middle school, they'd say, "Can you drop me off like a block away so I don't have to be even seen getting out of the car?" One time we went to a Christian concert, and I began to notice where my oldest daughter was sitting, and I was trying to figure out from a geometric point of view, she was as far away as she could be from me and still be in the building. Do you remember some of this?
Yes, absolutely. I remember saying those exact words to my mom, "Honey, Mom, just let me off here." "Well, honey, wear a block. I want these shoes. I got to work these tennis shoes in a little bit." I mean, we just lie through our teeth to get out of there. And couldn't our parents buy cooler cars than what they bought back in those days? These four-door ugly cars. But that's beside the point. But I think what's sort of fun, I spent a lot of time talking about marriage, and marriage is not going well either, quite frankly.
Sure.
But I think there's a similarity between middle schoolers and husbands. As husbands, and I've been married for 48 years in a row to a very lucky woman, and I think us husbands hate questions. I don't think it. I know it. We hate questions. We hate the why word. And I tell parents in Planet Middle School, you'd be so smart to try to discipline yourself not to ask questions. Well, here's the problem. Women love questions. They're wordsmiths. They use 3.5 times the number of words that Kerby and Kevin use in a given day or week.
Right.
And it's hard to get them to think differently.
Sure.
But the typical kid comes home from school, middle school, and what does mom or dad say? "How was your day today at school?"
Boy. Yeah.
"Fine." Teenager, where you been? Out. What'd you do? Nothing. I mean, save your breath. If you could, because these kids come home and they become slamming clickers, which is actually flight attendant lingo. Mm-hmm. A slamming clicker is one who comes off their duty, their 3-day trip, and they go to the hotel and they slam and click the door. They're not going out with the crew to do anything. They're just tired.
Slam and clickers.
Well, kids become slam and clickers. They go to their bedroom, they slam and click their doors shut, and then they text their buddies like a woodpecker that's got ADHD, and they systematically shut us out of their life. So my suggestion to parents is, you hear the music blaring in the kids' room.
Yeah.
Go down there, knock on the door, and simply say, honey, could you turn that up? And the kid will look at you like, what? Would you turn that up? And the kid will go over and turn it up, say, louder. And say, by the way, I'd love to talk to you about that group. You must really love them. I hear that a lot in the house. So I know you're busy now, but someday I'd love to just hear from you what makes this group so cool in your mind. Now, all I'm saying is, do you want to dialogue with your kid? Mm-hmm. Do you want to invite them into your life? Do you want to go in their life? Because if you don't, they're going to shut you down.
Yeah. Now, one of the things you say is that we have to be an authority without being authoritarian, and so sometimes it's consequences. And you use an example in the book there that matter of fact, you were talking to a single mom, and it was a situation where he says, well, I've tried to get my kids to obey, but I've never been able to get them to obey. And so you said, well, do you want to give up? And you said, just here's a good example. You come home, and you look and notice that your daughter still left her science project out there on the table, and it's keeping you from being able to do the kitchen. And so you say, honey, I can't get to the kitchen because of all the material here. I'm going to leave, and I'll come back in an hour, and if you clean it up, I'll be able to cook dinner, but if not, no dinner tonight. And all of a sudden, then it puts all the responsibility on your daughter, and you're not the nagging mom, right?
Even better is if you see that mess, and you just say to yourself, I think I'm going to go hit Denny's and get the Grand Slam. And you go out and you leave, and the kids sitting there going, where'd Mom go? Anybody know where Mom went?
Yeah.
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
And an hour later, she comes back, and the kids are now their stomachs are growling. Mom, what are we going to eat? Honey, I just ate. I just went down. I had a Grand Slam down there at Denny's. And what about? Well, honey, nothing. There's no way I could prepare a dinner. I mean, all that stuff's there. I mean, I would have been glad to cook for you guys, but you guys are. If you don't want to do it, you don't want to do it.
Yeah.
It's okay. I'm sure you guys can find something to eat out there. In other words, part of it is being a little deadpan.
Yeah.
And saying, you know what? It's not the end of the world. Don't look for trouble.
Yep.
Because these kids will. They'll throw some things our way to see if they can get us engaged. Mm-hmm. And so many times parents just, open up their sails and catch the kids' wind. Well, figuratively, what happens? Well, that wind nails you against the wall.
It sure does.
So don't look for trouble. So back to husbands and wives in the similarity. Ladies, when your husband says something really dumb, do you think you could just look at him and say, wow, wow, interesting? Now, you can be thinking, ladies, you're an idiot. Just don't say it. Well, the same thing is true with kids. I mean, if you tell a middle schooler the sky is blue, some of them will say, no, it's aqua.
Yeah.
Now, is that really worth fighting? And by the way,
pick your battles.
If you have a competitive marriage and someone's winning, you both lose. Marriage isn't a competitive sport. Neither is rearing kids. So don't look for trouble. Try to stay a step ahead, which is difficult. Because these kids, they can't walk through an archway in your home without hitting it.
You said that, or making verb sounds, or some of the others.
Yeah.
You get a whole long list of all things that middle schoolers do, and I thought, that's very accurate.
There's not many parents listening to us right now who have kids in the middle school who haven't thought of FedExing their kid to a far-off land.
Yes.
I mean, it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
We love them, and we'd like to string them up sometimes. And so keeping that balance means, hey, husband and wife, are you on the same page? Keep in mind that kids prosper from having parents who are on the same page, who are predictable and mundane. The mundane can be good. I mean, kids tell me, and I'm talking to kids, that I loved it when Mom would make a little cartoon or a little character on my lunch, or put a little prayer on there, or a little saying or something. And if you don't think those things are important, parent, just all of a sudden stop doing it.
Oh, then you hear about it.
Yeah. You hear about it.
That's right.
So don't sell yourself short. I think parents need to be reminded, Kerby, that these kids actually want us to affirm them.
Yeah, and that's one of the more controversial things in your book, because I think there are some people listening right now that say, really? That my kids really want me to accept them and to affirm them? I get the feeling that they just want me out of their life.
Well, I'm the guy that wrote the birth order book, and I'm here to tell you the firstborn is going to turn left or right, and the secondborn is going to turn left or right, but not both of them are going to go the same direction.
Yeah.
It's interesting. If you look at King Solomon in Proverbs 3:1-6, I wrote a little book on that.
Yeah.
And the last verse, and he will direct your paths. It's plural. We don't just have one path in life.
Right.
And these kids, let's face it, they're dumb as mud.
Yeah.
That's why God gave us parents to help move kids in the right direction. But I think for that parent who is really struggling, and they got a 13-year-old who's got a mouth on them that doesn't stop, they're using 4-letter words with them and everything else, I do have a suggestion, and that is toilet paper. Now, I prefer 2-ply. If you want 1-ply, go ahead, but I like 2-ply. Now, let's just, for the sake of argument, let's call him 14. He's 14 years of age. He's now a freshman in high school. And I'd like you to get 18 pieces of jointed toilet paper. I'd like you to get your kids' attention, say, honey, I need to talk to you for just a minute. I know you're busy. What is it, Mom? Honey, I just need 2 minutes. Just have a seat. I want to talk to you. Now, spread out those 18. He's 14. So let's drop one at a time, 14 of them. And now we hold 4. Now, again, the kid is thinking, Mom has lost it.
Yes.
There's something seriously wrong with my mom.
With it, yes.
Say, honey, you made it really clear that you're unhappy living in this house. You don't like our rules. You diss your sister. You're very disrespectful to me as well as your dad. And I just want you to think about something. You got 4 more years to serve in this prison. Okay? And these years can be good years. There's some perks from being in our family. And by the way, do you think that Dad and I would ever give the keys to the family car to a kid that was not responsible at the home or school? In other words, you plant some seeds in the kid's mind. Say, you know what, honey?
Yeah.
It's your choice. You know, you can pay me now or pay me later kind of attitude. And I think kids need to know that in 4 years, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do in life? And I think so many parents coddle their kids, send them off to a liberal arts school.
Snowplow parents.
Get them in debt.
Yep.
And then the kid, he can't even get a job after 4 years, and he comes back, he becomes a boomerang kid and lives with you.
Yeah, that's right.
You want to call the local pest control to get rid of him.
So get your 18 squares and put 14 down and show what the final 4 in the prison.
And it sounds a little crazy, but it works.
I'm sure
gets kids' attention.
All of a sudden, yes.
Yeah. And isn't that the reality?
Time is running out.
We're training up a child. Most of us don't train up a child. Most of us train down children.
Yeah.
We talk down to them.
Yeah. We're supposed to eventually put ourselves out of a job. When we come back, we'll talk about the sexual revolution and the technological revolution that's made Planet Middle School even more difficult. Kevin Leman with us. We'll be back right after this.
We have never done this before. We are asking you, as a point of view listener and supporter, to step up this week and lead others in giving. We are building a match challenge fund for next week's Truth Team 360 event. A way to take your donation, your gift, your partnership with Point of View and double it. Double it. You give this week, and next week, your gift will encourage someone else to join. Now is for you to take the plunge and consider what you can do. I'm looking for 43 people to give in honor of our 43 years of ministry. Whether it's $30, $3,000, or $300,000, all one-time and monthly gifts will be doubled. Doubled. Call now. 1-800-347-5151 or give online, pointofview.net. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Click the Build a Match banner and double your investment in the Truth Team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Dr. Kevin Leman with us in studio today, Planet Middle School. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some of those phone calls a little bit later if we have time. Otherwise, you can just sit back and listen to the wisdom and the wit of Kevin Leman. You know, the sex issue is very important. You have chapters here on talking to your kids about this issue long before they make their way into middle school, but also the sexual temptations and all of the rest. This, again, is very different in a whole new environment. If I wanted to see pornography when I was in the middle school, which I didn't, but if I might be curious about it, I might glimpse that because a neighbor boy had one of Dad's Playboys. But now, it's just a mouse click away. So this is a very different kind of world that we're raising our kids in.
Well, you just triggered a thought. Moonhead Deach, my best friend in life, we grew up on National Geographic. That was our
Sears
introduction.
And Roebuck are the Montgomery Ward catalogs.
Yeah,
there's enough in there to get a boy going.
Oh, my goodness, Kerby, things have changed.
Yes.
And one of the things that I tell parents is this, that at age 9 and 10. Now, again, I think most parents who love their kids and they love the Lord, they want to keep these kids as naive, and youthful, and unassuming as you possibly can. Unfortunately, things are thrown at kids today at warp speed, and it seems like that isn't very possible. So with just a touch of a button, a kid can see things that will imprint their brain for life, quite frankly. But I suggest to parents at age 9 and 10, now that's awful young, and many parents, 9 and 10, what we know about kids is they think a lot about sex at age 9 and 10. Very different from your generation, okay? At 11 and 12, they talk a lot about sex. Now, here's the hard part, parents. At 13 and 14, you really don't want to know what's happening. But it's happening with huge numbers. And the interesting thing is the kind of sex that kids are enjoying is, in their mind, not sex.
Yes.
And it's terrible that we've gone that far. But I'm just asking the parents, hey, listen, get on the interstate. Start talking to your kids. There's something very comfortable about looking at that white stripe go by as you're talking to your kid about something as uncomfortable as sex. And again, there's not a parent in the world who grew up this morning or woke up this morning and said, you know what I'd like to do today? I'd like to talk to my kid about sex. I understand that. And your kid who's in that car, and the reason I say the interstate is he's looking out the side window saying, I cannot believe this conversation. But dads need to talk specifically to daughters. Daddies are in a great position to tell a daughter how men view women. Women are in a great position to tell a young man such basic things as women don't like to be grabbed. You know, if that's going to change, I think it changes because parents stand up to the plate, have an open relationship with their kids. And if you hear things at school and you're confused as what that term meant, or maybe it's bad language or whatever, we want you to come to us and ask, and we'll always give you a straight answer. And we won't ask you any questions. We'll just give you the information. Okay? And when you cut that deal with your kid, if you do it right, I talk with a lot of parents who have a very robust, wonderful, healthy conversation with their kid about sex. In the church, we've demonized sex. If God is the creator of sex, and he certainly is, within the proper confines, what's better than sex? I've written books on the subject, and I'm old, but our kids are embarrassed to think that we, at our age, still have sexual thoughts. I have plenty of them.
Well, and in your book, you also talk about we're helping them become men and women, and they're trying to figure out, in this time of gender confusion and this time of sexual images and all that, it's difficult to figure out what it means to be a godly woman or a godly man. It's difficult to figure out what it means to be a man in the first place. So this is a time when they will look from all appearances like they don't want you to talk about this and that they really don't care. But in their heart, they really want you to give them some direction and guidance, don't they?
They absolutely do need direction. They want direction. Publishers always get upset when I mention other books, but I think the best book I ever wrote was a book called Sheet Music. And it's a guide for couples. And it's jam-packed with great stuff. And the parents who read that tell me that empowered me to be able to talk to my kids more directly. In the church, I think we've done a terrible job at talking about sex. We just basically avoid it. So it's here to stay. The images that bombard our kids daily. I mean, if you want to sell a boat, okay, you make boats. And so there's a boating magazine, all over the place. What would you possibly put in the boat, in your commercial, in your picture? You'd put a young woman.
Of course.
In a bikini. I mean, it just draws a male's eyes instantly, okay? And now, what you have to understand is that's how God created us, folks. Now, if you want to send me a nasty email about that, go right ahead. It's Leman, L-E-M-A-N. But that's how I see it. And so we have a choice to talk turkey to our kids or not. And it can be done. Is it comfortable? No, but it gets more comfortable the more you talk. It's not a talk. It's an ongoing dialogue with these kids.
Conversation, yeah.
And this just goes back to the fact that you need to shoot it straight to your kids. And the other factor that we need to bring up when we talk about fun.
There, good point.
For the past 14 years, I've done cruises. And in fact, I told the people, I don't want to do a cruise. They said, you get to travel. I said, oh, great. Now I know I don't want to do a cruise. Well, I ended up going with my wife, and I've spoken now for 14 years. And this year we go out of Fort Lauderdale down to the Eastern Caribbean, which I love. But if I'm in a church and I'm talking about coming to our cruise, I always say this. I say, if you're a fun person, we'd love to have you on our cruise. And if you're not a fun person, we'd prefer you stay home. And I think one of the things that's missing in families, especially with these kids, the book says awkward moments. These kids trip over their own feet. They're clumsy. They do and say stupid things. They show up with food on their mouth. I think you have to take those things in stride. You have to be able to laugh at ourselves. Kids love stories. When was the last time you told a story revealing some of the rather awkward things that you did in your life?
Right.
My life's been an open book to my kids. I've written about all the things I've got into. And, when you get close to death like I am, you get awards, and they give you honorary doctorate degrees and all these kind of things. And I got a note, Kerby, from my high school. They wanted to bring me back and put me on their Wall of Fame.
Wall of Fame.
I said to my wife, I'm not missing this. I'm going back for this one. It's in Williamsville, New York, outside of Buffalo. My mom lived to be 95.
How about that?
And I got a chance. It was one of the best conversations I ever had with my mom. And I had a very good, close relationship with my mom all the way up. And the conversation went like this. I said, hey, Mom, we fooled a few people, didn't we? And she says, oh, honey, I am so proud of you. And she was. We found pictures after her death that she had taken of me when I was on Oprah and Phil Donahue.
Oh, how about that?
She took a picture of the TV. Yeah. I mean, she was proud of her kids, all of them, all three of us. But as we were driving up to that reception, I turned to her, I said, Mom, do you remember the night the cops brought me home? And she said, oh, I do. But you were such a good boy. And everything I brought up, Kerby, she came back with, oh, I do remember that, but you were such a good boy. And all I could think of was Paul's letter to the Italians over in Romans 8:39, where it says, nothing separates you from the love of Christ.
Yeah.
And isn't that a mother's love?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that what we should emulate? That, you'd love to string them up. You'd love to UPS them here or there. Yeah. But, the fact is, there are flesh. If you love your kid, you must discipline them. But I think walking that tightrope between the authoritarian, you're going to do what I tell you to do, and the permissive, if you don't hey, would you kids turn that music down? I'm trying to do your homework. And parents today snowplow the roads of life for kids.
Right.
They don't want the kids to fail at anything. I just say, hey, parents, Think about this.
Right.
Anybody who's successful in life, what has been in their life? Failure.
Yeah.
So failure isn't fatal.
No, they need to know how to recover from failure, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Kevin Leman, he was such a good boy.
Yeah, I'm such a good boy, right?
Just a good boy. We'll take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about life mapping for just a minute, because we want to set them on the road. There's a time in which eventually we want to put ourselves out of a job. You're always going to be the parent. You're always going to be the father or the mother. But there is going to be a time where they're going to have to make those decisions on their own, and they're going to have to figure that out. And you can't necessarily be the helicopter parent or the snowplow parent. Kind of reminds me of that story in USA Today the other day where somebody in human resources said that when the millennial came in, the parents came in for the job interview. That'll make your teeth ache, won't it? We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Kevin Leman in studio with us for a few more minutes, and I might just mention that you can find his webpage, but also if you click on his Facebook page or some others, you can find Twitter, and we were just talking about, this is so fun. Everybody's got to go to, again, Dr. Kevin Leman, or again, the link is already there. Scroll down a little bit, and these were some pictures that the kids who were listening to you at Lenexa Kansas. I know where that is, West Side Family Church, and you put the pictures up there.
They were so funny. This young mom came up and said, my kids thought you were awesome. They listened to every word, but they did do a little artwork on the picture.
On the pictures.
Yeah, and, with earrings and, oh my goodness, it was just so fun.
So again, that's a good way people can follow you. 65,000 people are following you right now, so they can kind of know what you're doing. But we were talking for just a minute, and we're almost out of time, but life mapping is one of the chapters in your book, and that's a concern because we want our children to land well, and we want to eventually recognize that even at the age of 14, you got 4 years left, and if they're just finishing middle school, they're trying to figure out high school, SATs, college, career, and we really need to help them with that, but at the same time, they need to make those decisions on their own. So how do we work our way through that?
Well, in preparation for just middle school, I mean, kids are in a self-contained classroom for a number of years. All of a sudden, they start changing. I think a parent helps by helping a kid get organized.
Yes.
But back to the toilet paper we talked about, yes, that can be used with kids who have really gone off the deep end one way or another. But it can be used with life mapping. And simply to say, in 4 more years, my goodness, you're going to be gone. Mm-hmm. And we need to start thinking about, what you're going to do in life. Mm-hmm. And if there's one thing you have a passion for, what would that one thing be?
Yeah.
And my advice as old dean of students was, hey, what do you have a passion for in life? What do you really love doing? Yeah. Figure out a way to make a living doing that. Because there's nothing worse than going to work and hating what you do.
So many people, I think 2/3 of Americans say they hate what they do and they hate work. And you just can't live through life if that's the case.
A kid who says he wants to be a dentist, can he shadow a dentist on a Saturday?
Sure.
Do you know a dentist in your community your kid could hang out with? I mean, sometimes kids see that and say, gee, I don't think I'd want to do that for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. But they need experiences. Internships are always good.
Oh, very
at
good.
Any level, especially, once these kids hit these years. The other thing I like to point out to kids is someone is going to look at a screen on a computer or maybe an 8x11 piece of paper. It's going to have your name, social security number, and they're going to make all kinds of guesstimates about who you are based upon what's on that.
Yes.
So that's why grades are important. Mm-hmm. That's why school is important. That's why being diligent is important. And talk to any employer today. They'll tell you it's hard to get people to simply do what you ask them to do. So I think you come along and you sort of champion these kids' ideas. You try to encourage it as best you can. And yet they need to know that there's some limits here in our family about how far we can go financially to help you. I think a kid going off to a school, getting a liberal arts degree, and coming home with $125,000 worth of debt is horrendous.
That's a prescription for disaster.
And I'll make a prediction. In 20 years, we'll have far less number of college students in colleges and universities.
I agree.
That whole landscape's going to change quickly.
It is changing very much so. You talked about looking at a piece of paper and choosing to hire that person or not hire them. That gets into something else that parents need to recognize. You need to explain to your kids that what you post that you think is really funny right now on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, this is going to follow you the rest of your life potentially. And people in human resources are going to check out, oh, your name is Buford Smith. Okay, let me say, oh, look at all the things he put there. Okay, I guess we're not interested in him for an employee.
Are you interested in college or pro football?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah.
You'll understand this well.
Yes.
I go to football practice at the University of Arizona as often as I can.
Right there in Tucson.
And those scouts are always there. Mm-hmm. And I had a scout tell me one day about this kid. He said, have you seen the kid's Facebook? I said, I haven't. He said, we're not interested in him.
Isn't that amazing?
And and this is an elite athlete.
Yeah.
And so I forgot what I called it in the book. It was the corollary commandment, something. I lost my train of thought on it. But what I said to the parent is remind that kid that never to send something that you wouldn't want grandma or mom to read. Mm-hmm. And it's just sort of a way of reminding them that once you pull that trigger, once you hit that send button, it's out there.
Yes.
And with girls today, quote my wife, Mrs. Uppington. She's Mrs. Uppington because she's the classy one of the two of us, the firstborn, the bossy one, who knows exactly how I ought to dress. The other day I went out, and she said, you're not wearing that outside, are you? And I said, what do you mean? Yeah, I'm going outside. She says, it's got a big spot on it. I said, honey, that's exactly my point. There's only one spot on it. I'll see you in a while. But, she says the 11-year-old female is the worst creature walking the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And these 11, 12-year-old girls, you talk about being catty and nasty behind the back.
They say it on Facebook and Twitter and all sorts of stuff,
so
blog posts.
Boys do stupid things, but boys are more likely to slug it out, where girls, the power of the pen.
Yes.
And you really have to guard against it. We've seen the tragic stories where kids have taken their life. Yes, because they've been cyberbullied.
About bullying and all sorts of stuff. You got chapters in here on cutting and things that we never had to talk about years ago. But I might just mention, you mentioned that in passing, you've got whole sections in the book on what worked for us and the corollaries. Here is the toilet paper wisdom on page 242.
Now, see, that comes from me talking to these parents.
Right. And so there's a lot of practical stuff.
This goes back to my kids saying, Dad, you got to be on Facebook. And I said, hey, what's Facebook?
Yeah.
And now I'm all over Facebook. But talking to parents around the world, these are concerns that parents really have. And cutting is one of the few things that kids feel like they have control over. As crazy as that sounds.
Sad.
So parents, are you a controller? Authoritarian? No. He is a supreme authority. The scripture says every knee shall bow. He doesn't grab us by the scruff of the neck, twist our earlobe, and say, you will acknowledge me. So again, there's only one way to parent a child.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to be consistent with the teachings of God's word, there it is. Be the authoritative parent. Is that difficult? Yes. Stop whining about it, parent, and do it.
That's good. Again, just before we run out of time, we have a link to your website, and it is thebirthorderguy.com is one of those, and you can find out more about Dr. Kevin Leman, speaking engagements, as well as their videos and some of the books, and of course, people can follow you on Twitter and Facebook. But just before I run out of time, talk about what's available on your website if people want to know a little bit more.
Well, we have podcasts on there, which when we first started doing podcasts, we chased Disney out of the number one slot of the most viewed and listened to podcasts. So they're there. Information about our cruises. We have a cruise in January, a cruise in February. One of them I call the cruise anybody can afford cruise. It's so cheap. But they're fun. They all go down the Eastern Caribbean. So I just think if you're a person of faith, you ought to be fun. You ought to be fun to be around. I'm bringing Dennis Swanberg with me.
Oh, that'll be fun.
Who is so incredibly funny.
Get the two of you together. That's
that boat rocks and rolls. So there's a lot of things on there. The podcasts are worth it. They're all free. And it's just a service. I do them every table, and a guy calls me from Oregon, and he lays them. But they're very conversational, and people tend to like them.
Good stuff. Dr. Kevin Leman, we've been doing this for years. Let's keep doing it again.
Hey, my pleasure. I've enjoyed being with you, Kirby. Thank you so much.
New studio, and you got to see that. So again, for those of you that didn't have a chance to hear all of this, you can download our podcast, or you can actually even see the livecast, see the interaction with us in studio, or go to our YouTube channel. It's all available at the website pointofview.net. So I hope you appreciated the conversation we've had today. Both hours, we have all that available to you. And take the time to maybe take some of that and send it to someone else. Put it on your Facebook page or your blog post, or send it to someone so that they'll know a little bit more about Planet Middle School. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
If someone offers you an investment that is sure to double your money, what's the best way to respond? Yeah, run away. Run now, but hear me out. Next week is our fall push to sign up new members for Truth Team 360. What we need today is a leader willing to encourage others to give. Your gift will be used to match their gifts next week. You might give $360 and officially join the team, or make that big donation, $1,000, $500,000, or perhaps for you a donation of $50 is as much of a sacrifice as it is for that person who gives $1 million. Bottom line, this week we are gathering matching gifts so that next week we can encourage everyone else to match what you do. Come on, you're the one. Call now, 800-347-5151. Or online, pointofview.net/team. We've never done this before. Be the one who steps up and leads. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.